The rain had been falling since morning, steady and relentless, soaking the sidewalks and painting the city in a dull gray sheen. Inside the towering glass hotel where Isabella worked, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne. A world away from the cramped apartment she called home. Her uniform hung loosely on her thin frame, its stiff white collar tugging at her neck as she carried a tray of half-cleared dishes toward the kitchen. Every step reminded her of the weight pressing on her shoulders. 2 little girls waiting for her return, medicine that needed buying, rent that was already overdue. She moved with practiced grace, quiet and unseen. Years of working among the wealthy had taught her that people like her were supposed to blend into the background, a shadow serving smiles and silence. Yet tonight, her body ached more than usual, her eyelids heavy from too many sleepless nights. Emma and Lily had both coughed themselves restless the night before, and she had stayed up beside their narrow bed, whispering songs and rubbing their backs until dawn. Their small hands clutching hers had given her strength, but now, under the bright lights of the ballroom, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. A voice barked orders across the floor. The manager waved her over, shoving another task her way before she could even set down the tray. She forced a polite smile, though her legs trembled from hours of rushing between tables. She bent, gathered scattered silverware, polished a glass until it gleamed. Each motion was mechanical, a rhythm of survival she had memorized long ago. But deep inside, beneath the layers of fatigue, there was still a spark, the thought of her daughter's laughter, the way they believed their mother could do anything. That belief kept her moving, no matter how heavy the burden became. The room shifted suddenly, as though a new current had entered and changed the air. Conversations stilled for a fraction of a second, waiters straightened their postures, and even the manager adjusted his tie with nervous fingers. Isabella noticed it too, a tension that rippled through the space. She didn't need to look to know someone important had arrived. She felt it in the silence that followed, the way the atmosphere bent, as though acknowledging a presence larger than life still. Curiosity betrayed her. She glanced up, tray balanced on her palm, and caught sight of him. Tall, impeccably dressed, his sharp features illuminated under the chandeliers. Adrian Moretti moved through the entrance like a man who carried the city on his shoulders. His reputation preceded him, whispers of power, of influence that stretched from boardrooms to courtrooms, of a man no one dared to cross. Yet it wasn't the rumors that left her momentarily frozen. It was the gravity in his eyes, a storm-gray gaze that swept across the room as if nothing could hide from it. Isabella lowered her head quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed her stare. Men like him didn't belong in her world. Men like him didn't pause for waitresses with worn shoes and raw fingertips. She returned to her duties, wiping a table, refilling glasses, doing everything she could to remain invisible. But her heart wouldn't steady. Something about that fleeting moment had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Hours passed in a blur of movement. The ballroom buzzed with music, glasses clinked, and laughter rose in waves. Isabella moved quietly between it all, fatigue dragging at her bones. When the crowd thinned and the noise softened, she finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. She leaned against a wall near the far corner, hidden from sight, and let her eyelids drift closed just for a breath. That breath turned into seconds, and those seconds slipped away without her realizing it. Her tray had been set down, her head tilted slightly to the side, her body surrendering to the exhaustion she had been fighting for days. The world around her melted into a haze. She didn't notice the man who had stepped away from the table, didn't feel the weight of his gaze settling on her. Adrian Moretti paused when he saw her, this woman who carried weariness like armor, yet somehow looked peaceful in her sleep. Something stirred in him, something rare, a quiet recognition he couldn't ignore. Instead of waking her, he simply lowered himself into the seat beside her, his arm resting where her head had gently fallen. She shifted slightly, finding comfort without knowing, and for the first time in years, Adrian let the moment remain undisturbed. Her breathing steadied against his arm, unaware of the eyes watching them both from across the room. For her, it was only a stolen moment of rest. For him, it was the beginning of something he hadn't expected, something that felt like destiny. And as he looked down at her, a whisper formed in his mind, one he didn't speak aloud yet, but carried with certainty. their lives were about to change forever. The following evening unfolded like any other. Yet Isabella felt an odd shift in the air, as if life itself had been tilted ever so slightly off its axis. She tried to shake the feeling as she hurried through the Grand Hotel's service corridor, adjusting her apron and tying her hair back. The fatigue from the previous night clung to her shoulders, but beneath it was something stranger, an echo of warmth she had carried home unknowingly. When she had woken in the storage room chair, she thought it had been a dream, that she had simply fallen asleep for a stolen moment. She never realized she had rested against the arm of Adrian Moretti himself. At home that morning, Emma had tugged at her sleeve with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Mommy, you look like you had a nice dream." Isabella had kissed her daughter's curls and laughed softly, promising it was nothing. But the truth was she hadn't dreamed in years. Real life never allowed such luxuries. Now, as she moved into the glittering ballroom once again, she felt her heart skip when she noticed him. Adrian Moretti. He was seated at the same private table near the corner, as though the city itself had bent to bring him here again. He was not alone. Of course, men in crisp suits lingered around him, their eyes sharp, their voices low. Yet despite the company, his gaze seemed to find her. She pretended not to notice, lowering her head as she carried a tray toward another table. But her hands trembled just enough for the glasses to chime against one another. She scolded herself silently. Men like him didn't notice women like her. Even if his eyes lingered, it must have been by chance. She delivered the drinks, collected empty plates, and reminded herself of the bills waiting at home. There was no room for distractions, not when her daughter's medicine had to be bought tomorrow. But as she turned back toward the kitchen, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You," said the manager sharply. "Table 17 needs service. Go." Her eyes followed where he pointed, and her breath caught. Table 17 was Adrian's. Every step toward him felt heavier than the last. She steadied her breathing, balancing the tray as though it were a lifeline. When she reached his table, she bowed her head politely, her voice low but steady. "Good evening. May I offer you the house special tonight?" For a moment, there was silence. Then she felt at the weight of his gaze, calm but unyielding, like a tide pulling her closer. She risked a glance upward, and their eyes met. Storm gray, unwavering. Something flickered there, not curiosity alone, but recognition. As though he had been expecting her. "Your recommendation," Adrian said finally, his voice smooth, measured. "I'll take whatever you suggest." She blinked, caught off guard. No guest had ever asked her opinion before, let alone a man of his stature. "The rosemary lamb," she answered quickly, her voice softer than she intended. "It's comforting." A corner of his mouth lifted, almost imperceptibly. "Then that is what I'll have." She noted his order, retreating toward the kitchen with her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled so fiercely she nearly dropped her notepad. What was she doing? She couldn't afford to let a moment like this unsettle her. And yet, even as she tried to return to routine, she felt his gaze follow her, steady as the rain outside. Later that evening, while the room thrummed with conversation and music, Isabella found herself summoned again to his table. He asked for water, though his glass was nearly full. She brought it, setting it carefully before him. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her once more. "Long hours for you," he said quietly. Not as a question, but a statement. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. "It's part of the job," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the polished floor. "You look tired." His tone wasn't mocking, nor pitying, simply observing. She lifted her gaze slightly, wary. "I manage." He studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, releasing her with silence. But the exchange lingered in her chest like a flame she couldn't extinguish. By the time her shift ended, Isabella's body was aching, yet her mind was restless. She hurried home through the damp streets, her shoes soaking through, her thin jacket no match for the cold. When she unlocked the apartment door, the sound of soft breathing met her ears. The twins were asleep, tangled together under a faded quilt. She knelt beside their bed, brushing stray curls from Emma's face, adjusting Lily's mismatched socks, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a fragile smile. Yet when she lay down on her own narrow mattress, exhaustion refused to take her fully. Instead, she saw his eyes, steady and stormy, echoing through her thoughts. She told herself it meant nothing, that it had to mean nothing. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet whisper insisted otherwise. Something had begun, and whether she was ready or not, their worlds were on the edge of colliding. The week stretched on, filled with the same endless cycle of work and exhaustion. But Isabella couldn't ignore the shift that had taken root in her life. It was subtle, like the faint scent of rain in the air before a storm. Something you couldn't see yet, but could feel deep in your bones. Every evening, as she tied her apron and stepped into the glittering ballroom, her heart braced itself against the possibility of seeing him again. And every evening, he was there, always in the same corner, always with the same air of control, his presence commanding attention without a single word. She tried to convince herself that it was coincidence, that a man like Adrian Moretti had no reason to notice her beyond the food and water she placed before him. Yet the truth pressed against her no matter how she fought it. His eyes lingered, not long, not overt, but enough for her to feel the quiet gravity pulling her in his direction. On the third night, fate decided to strip away the thin wall she had built between them. The ballroom was louder than usual, a charity gala filling the tables with diamonds, pearls, and champagne glasses. Isabella wove between the guests with her tray, shoulders stiff from balancing the weight. At the far end of the room, her manager was gesturing wildly, already unhappy with the staff's pace. She ducked her head, moving faster, until a guest suddenly shifted in his seat. Her elbow caught the corner of the tray, and a glass slipped. She gasped as it tilted forward, but before it could shatter, a hand caught it firmly. She looked up, stunned. Adrian Moretti stood before her, holding the glass as though it weighed nothing. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. "Careful," he said softly, setting the glass back onto her tray. "You shouldn't carry more than you can manage." Her cheeks burned with shame. "I am sorry," she stammered, ready for scolding. But there was no scolding, no irritation. Instead, his voice was even, almost gentle. "The weight is too much. Next time, take less." She nodded quickly, lowering her eyes, and hurried away. Yet the moment seared into her, not because he had spoken, but because he had noticed. In a room filled with glitter and grandeur, the most powerful man present had noticed her struggle, had steadied her instead of letting her fall. The rest of the night blurred. She moved as though in a daze, her hands working automatically while her thoughts tangled. By the time the gala ended and she slipped into the cold night air, her legs trembled from the long hours. The rain had returned, a fine mist clinging to her skin as she walked home through the narrow streets. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, thinking only of the warm bed where her daughters slept. But fate was not finished with her. Halfway down the block, her foot caught on a loose stone. The bag she carried tore open, spilling groceries into a puddle. She dropped to her knees, scooping up the bread and fruit with frantic hands, her throat tightening with frustration. The week's exhaustion, the endless bills, the fear of failure, all of it swelled inside her until her eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in the middle of the street. Then headlights swept across the pavement, and a sleek black car rolled to a stop nearby. Her breath caught as the door opened, and Adrian Moretti stepped out, an umbrella unfolding above his head. For a moment she froze, unable to process the sight of him here, in her neighborhood, on this rain-slick street. "You shouldn't be walking home alone at this hour," he said, his voice steady over the drizzle. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the torn bag to her chest. "I'll be fine. It's not far." His eyes scanned the cracked pavement, the faded street lamps, the way she shivered in her thin coat. He said nothing, but there was something in his expression, an unspoken understanding, a recognition of how hard she was fighting to stay upright in a world that seemed determined to drag her down. "Let me take you," he said finally. She shook her head quickly, panic fluttering in her chest. "No, thank you. I can't, I don't." She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Accepting help from a man like him felt dangerous, like stepping into a current that could sweep her away. But he didn't push. Instead, he extended the umbrella, tilting it slightly so the rain no longer struck her shoulders. "At least take this," he said. "You'll catch cold otherwise." The gesture was simple, yet it undid her. She stared at the umbrella, then at him, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she took it from his hand. Their fingers brushed for the briefest instant, and something unspoken passed between them, a spark. Faint but undeniable. She whispered a thank you, clutching the umbrella like it was both shield and promise. He gave a small nod, then stepped back toward his car. As the vehicle pulled away, Isabella stood in the rain-soaked street, her groceries damp in her arms, her heart racing in a way she couldn't explain. She had lived years convinced that no one truly saw her, that she was just another shadow moving silently through the world. But tonight, for the first time, someone had, and though she didn't know it yet, that simple act of kindness was the beginning of something far greater, something that would change not only her life but the lives of the two little girls waiting for her at home. The umbrella still leaned against the corner of Isabella's small apartment 2 nights later, a silent reminder of the stranger who had pressed it into her hands beneath the rain. She had meant to return it somehow, perhaps by leaving it at the hotel lobby for one of his assistants. But every time she thought of doing so, something stopped her. It wasn't the object itself, it was the memory of the moment, the weight of his gaze, the way he had spoken as though he saw her in a way no one else did. She tried to bury the thought, yet it followed her through each exhausting shift, through every lullaby sung to her daughters, through every sleepless night spent worrying over bills. That evening, she was running late. Emma had woken with a cough, and Isabella couldn't leave until she was sure the medicine had worked and the girls were settled safely with Mrs. Patel next door. By the time she hurried into the hotel, tying her apron with trembling hands, the ballroom was already alive with laughter and music. She kept her head down, slipping into the rhythm of service, moving between tables with the careful balance of someone who could not afford a single mistake. Hours passed before she saw him. Adrian sat in his usual place, but tonight he wasn't surrounded by a lively group. Only 2 men flanked him, their quiet conversation hushed and watchful. Isabella felt his gaze almost before she looked up. It was steady, unshaken, as though he had been waiting. Her pulse quickened, and she hurried to the kitchen with an empty tray, willing herself to forget the way her heart seemed to leap whenever his eyes found hers. But fate did not leave her the choice of forgetting. Later that night, as she was gathering discarded glasses near the side entrance, she heard Emma's name carried faintly across the wind. The sound froze her. She turned sharply, realizing too late she had left her phone in her bag. Mrs. Patel's voice carried faintly on the other end of the hotel's phone line. When the kitchen staff called her over, her neighbor sounded worried. Emma's cough had worsened, and Lily was crying for their mother. Isabella's blood ran cold. She fumbled with her apron, apologizing frantically to the manager, but he barely listened, muttering about short staffing and full tables. Desperation rose in her chest. She couldn't stay, not when her daughters needed her. She slipped through the side exit, her shoes pounding against the wet pavement as she ran through the rain-slick streets. She hadn't made it to blocks when headlights cut across her path. The same sleek black car stopped at the curb, the window rolling down. Adrian's face emerged in the dim light, calm but intent. "You shouldn't be out here alone again," he said. "I don't have time," she blurted, her voice cracking with panic. "My daughters, they're sick. I have to go." For a moment, the silence stretched, his eyes narrowing as though measuring her words. Then, without hesitation, he opened the door. "Get in." Every instinct told her to refuse. She didn't know him, not truly. His world was one of shadows and power, a world she had no place in. But the thought of Emma's small frame trembling with fever stripped her of hesitation. She climbed into the car, clutching her arms around herself, every muscle tense. The ride was swift, the city's lights flashing past in streaks of gold and silver. Isabella's thoughts raced ahead of the car, already at the apartment, already holding her daughters close. When they finally arrived, she stumbled out, thanking him quickly, ready to disappear inside. But Adrian didn't stay in the car. He followed. She turned sharply. "You don't need to let me," he interrupted simply, his voice low but firm. Inside, the apartment was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling, the furniture sparse. Yet it was warm, filled with the soft hum of a lullaby Mrs. Patel was humming as she rocked Lily in her arms. Emma lay on the bed, her cheeks flushed, her breathing heavy but even. Isabella rushed to her side, smoothing damp curls from her forehead, whispering gentle words. Relief washed over her as she felt the medicine working, though her hands trembled as she held her daughter close. When she finally looked up, she realized Adrian was still there. He stood quietly near the door, his gaze sweeping the small space, pausing on the drawings taped to the wall, the scattered toys on the floor, the second-hand books stacked neatly on the shelf. His eyes softened in a way she hadn't expected, as though the hardened edges of his world couldn't withstand the simple innocence of this one. "Twins," he said finally, his voice more of a thought than a statement. Isabella's breath caught. She nodded, pulling the blanket higher over Emma's small shoulders. "Emma and Lily, they're all I have." Adrian studied her then, his gaze returning to the fragile girls who slept despite the storm outside. Something stirred in his expression, something unguarded. He didn't speak further, but when his eyes met hers, she felt the weight of it, an unspoken vow, a recognition of something larger than either of them could deny. For Isabella, it was a moment she would never forget. The most powerful man in the city, standing silently in her worn little apartment, looking at her daughters as though they were already his. And though she didn't yet know what it meant, the whisper of fate curled around her heart, promising that life would never again be the same. The morning after Adrian had stepped into her apartment, Isabella woke with the strange sensation that her life no longer belonged solely to her. She watched the twins stir under the covers, their soft breaths filling the quiet room, and she couldn't shake the image of his figure standing in the doorway, his eyes lingering on Emma and Lily with a depth that unsettled her. He had left without a word, leaving only the sound of his car fading into the night, but his presence lingered like a shadow in her chest. She tried to push the memory away as she hurried through her routine. The girls needed breakfast, their medicine needed measuring, and the bus wouldn't wait for a mother running late. By the time she reached the hotel, her mind was already consumed by the fear of losing her job. She had left her shift early the night before without permission, and Marco, the manager, was not a forgiving man. Sure enough, the moment she entered the staff corridor, his voice cut through the air like a whip. "Isabella, office, now." Her stomach dropped. She followed him into the cramped space, the door clicking shut behind her. Marco's face was pinched with disdain. "You think you can disappear in the middle of a shift and come back like nothing happened? Do you know how important last night was? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot." She clenched her hands together, fighting the urge to plead. "I'm sorry. My daughter was sick. Excuses," he snapped, waving her words away. "Do you know how many people are lined up for this job? People who would actually take it seriously. You're one warning away from being out of here. Don't test me." Her chest ached with humiliation, but she bowed her head, whispering an apology before retreating. She had no choice but to endure. Losing this job would mean losing everything. That evening, as the ballroom filled with another wave of guests, Isabella worked harder than ever, moving swiftly between tables, ignoring the ache in her feet and the sting in her throat. She avoided Adrian's table, afraid to meet his eyes, afraid of what they might reveal. But avoiding him proved impossible. Midway through the night, Marco cornered her again near the service doors. His tone was sharp, his words cutting. "You think I didn't notice you spilling drinks the other night? Or how slow you've been tonight? You're an embarrassment. Don't expect me to cover for you again." Isabella lowered her gaze, willing herself not to break. But before Marco could continue, another voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem?" Her head snapped up. Adrian stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. Marco paled instantly, his mouth opening and closing before he forced a nervous smile. "No, sir, just ensuring my staff maintains standards." Adrian's eyes flicked to Isabella, then back to Marco. "Standards are important, but so is knowing the value of loyalty." His words were calm, but there was an edge beneath them that made the air heavy. "Don't mistake dedication for weakness." Marco swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Moretti." He offered a stiff nod before retreating, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to say, her tongue caught between gratitude and fear. She opened her mouth, but Adrian shook his head slightly, silencing her before she could speak. "Don't waste your energy on men like him," he said quietly. "Focus on what matters." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her trembling in the wake of his words. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. No one dared scold her. No one dared raise their voice in her direction. It was as though a protective barrier had settled around her, unseen but powerful. She finished her shift without incident, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. When she returned home, the twins ran into her arms, their laughter echoing through the small apartment. She held them tighter than usual, her eyes burning with unspoken emotion. For years, she had fought every battle alone. Every hardship, every sleepless night, every unpaid bill, she had carried it on her shoulders without anyone to share the weight. But now, a man she barely knew had stepped in, shielding her from a world that had never shown her mercy. It should have frightened her. It should have made her push him away. And yet, when she kissed her daughters' foreheads and tucked them into bed, she felt something else instead. Hope. Fragile, dangerous, impossible hope. Because deep down, she knew the truth. Adrian Moretti was no ordinary man passing through her life. He was already threading himself into it, silently and steadily, as though he belonged, and though she could not yet see where this path would lead. Her heart whispered the secret she dared not speak aloud. Her daughters were no longer unseen, no longer just hers. Someone else had noticed them. Someone else had begun to claim them in the quiet way he looked at them. It was only a matter of time before he said the words out loud. The days that followed felt like a dream Isabella was too afraid to wake from. Work was still grueling, the long hours still stretched her thin, and the weight of bills still pressed heavily against her chest. But something had shifted. The shadows that once seemed endless now held a sliver of light. Wherever she turned, Adrian's presence was never far, steady and silent, like the tide at the edge of the shore. He never demanded her attention, never intruded, yet the world seemed to bend whenever he was near, as if fate itself insisted on drawing their paths closer. The twins noticed it first. Emma tugged on Isabella's sleeve one evening as they shared a simple dinner at home, mismatched bowls of soup warming their small table. "Mommy," she whispered, glancing toward the window. The man with the gray eyes was outside today. Isabella's spoon froze midair. "What man, sweetheart?" The tall one, Lily, chimed in, swinging her legs from the chair. "He gave Mrs. Patel her groceries when her arms were too full. He smiled at us." Isabella's chest tightened. She wanted to dismiss it, to brush away their words as childish imagination. But the warmth in her daughters' voices told her otherwise. Adrian had found his way into their little world, not by force but by choice, and that realization both terrified and comforted her. The turning point came on a night heavy with rain. Isabella was late again, caught between her shift and her daughter's needs. Her body and spirit stretched to breaking. She had just finished serving a large party when Marco cornered her once more, his face red with irritation. "You're too slow, Isabella, too distracted. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to replace you." Her throat tightened, fear and exhaustion threatening to spill into tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "That won't happen." Adrian stood behind her, his presence silencing the room. Every conversation around them seemed to fade, the air thick with something unspoken. Marco stammered, trying to recover, but Adrian's gaze pinned him where he stood. "She's not leaving this place. Not now, not ever unless she chooses to." The manager paled, nodding quickly, retreating with muttered apologies. Isabella's heart raced, her breath caught between gratitude and dread. She turned to Adrian, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have." "I protect what matters," he interrupted softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And you matter more than you realize." That night, she couldn't sleep. His words echoed in her mind, wrapping around her like a promise she didn't know how to accept. For so long, she had taught herself that survival meant standing alone, that needing anyone was dangerous. But when she looked at Emma and Lily, curled together in their small bed, she knew the truth: she had never truly been alone. And now, for the first time, someone else had chosen to stand beside her. The next evening, Adrian appeared at her apartment unannounced. The twins greeted him at the door without fear, as if they had known him their entire lives. He stepped inside cautiously, his gaze softening as he took in the humble space once more. Emma climbed into his lap without hesitation, holding out her favorite book. "Will you read to us?" she asked. Isabella froze, unsure whether to intervene. But Adrian only smiled faintly and opened the worn pages. His deep voice carried through the small room, steady and warm, filling every corner with a sense of safety Isabella had almost forgotten existed. Lily nestled against his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve, as though she had found something she had been missing all along. When the story ended and the girls drifted into sleep, Isabella carefully lifted the book from his hands. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "They've never taken to anyone like this before." Adrian's gaze met hers, unwavering. "Because they see what I see." He rose to his feet, stepping closer, his voice quiet but certain. "They're not just your burden, Isabella. They're not just yours to carry. They're mine, too." Her breath caught, her heart thundering in her chest. "You can't just say that," she whispered, though the protest lacked strength. He didn't flinch. "I can, because it's true. From the moment I saw you, from the moment I stepped into this home, I knew. Those girls, your girls, are ours, and I will protect them as fiercely as you do. Nothing will harm them, not while I draw a breath." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. For years, she had fought alone, convinced the world had no place for her or her daughters. But now, standing before her, was a man whose world was larger than anything she could imagine. A man who carried storms in his eyes and yet spoke to her children, as if they were the most precious treasures he had ever held. She didn't answer immediately. Words felt too small for the weight of what she felt. Instead, she let her gaze fall to Emma and Lily, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the promise that had just been spoken over their lives. A promise that would change everything. In that moment, Isabella understood something she had never dared believe. She was no longer invisible. Her daughters were no longer unseen. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't carrying the weight alone. The world outside might still be cruel, uncertain, filled with storms, but inside their little home, a new truth had taken root. A truth whispered in the quiet of the night, sealed by the certainty in Adrian's eyes. They were his now, too. They were theirs.